Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is David Waddington, a professor in the Department of Education at Concordia University. David specializes in the philosophy of education, and his research interests include teacher-free speech, video games and citizenship, philosophical questions in science and technology education, and the history and philosophy of progressive education. David is also a big fan of John Dewey, the famous philosopher of education from the United States. In addition to these interests, our guest is also co-director of the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance, a multi-institutional research center at Concordia University here in Montreal, Canada, that seeks to advance scholarship on teaching and learning processes and to develop new pedagogical tools and practices for education in both formal and non-formal settings. David, hello and welcome. Thanks for coming today.
Well, thanks a lot, Paul. It's a great pleasure for me to be here.
You have such an accomplished and rich portfolio, and you've done so much. Could you please tell us a little more about your research interests?
So I have a couple of different research interests. For one thing, I work on free speech in the classroom, especially teacher-free speech. What can teachers say about controversial issues? How do they tend to handle controversial issues? How do they face pressure from various stakeholders like teachers, principals, and students on controversial issues? What are the kind of legal and ethical boundaries that surround these kinds of questions? So I've done a fair amount of work on that, which has actually been in cooperation with folks at McGill and University of Montreal as well. I also do work on video games. I'm currently finishing up a book. It's with the press. It's called The Hidden Curriculum of Video Games. It's a pretty negative analysis of video games, actually, but I'm pretty excited about it. It's a book I've wanted to write for a very, very long time. And that's pretty much it for these days. Occasionally, I still do some work on John Dewey's philosophy, which is an enduring source of inspiration for me. I still do a little bit of work on science and technology education, but mainly these days, it's either controversial issues in the classroom or video game stuff.
If I'm not mistaken, you have a PhD in philosophy from Stanford.
Well, I do, in fact, have a PhD from Stanford. It's a PhD in philosophy of education, which is a PhD in education. But when I was there, I specialized specifically in Dewey's philosophy of education. So I was very much focused on philosophy. And I actually have a master's degree in the history of philosophy from Stanford too, and a BA that specialized in the history of philosophy as well. So I've always kind of been at the intersection of historical questions, education, and philosophy, you might say.
And what led you to want to study philosophy?
Well, I mean, what led me
or study philosophy of education.
Well, okay, I'll tell you what led me to study philosophy first of all, okay, which is I was in my first year of university and I was feeling a little bit rebellious against my high school days, and my English teacher in high school had made fun of philosophy a little bit. And I thought to myself, well, my English teacher was making fun of it, but hey, maybe there's something to it. After all, I'll take a course on Plato's Republic. So I took this course on Plato's Republic, and it really changed my life to kind of do a close reading of a book like that, a real foundational book in Western philosophy, to get into thinking about the world of that book and the ideas in that book, which as a kid from rural Nova Scotia were extremely strange to me. To get into that book was just a real formative experience for me. I mean, that was one of the most amazing classes that I've taken in my life and really altered my trajectory quite a lot, Paul.
Were there any key ideas that stood out?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know looking back. I mean, one of the things that I remember from that class is my prof at the time said, look, guys, you can read this book as a flow of somebody else's ideas that you have to master. Or you can read this book as something that has something really significant to say about life, about your life, about the world that you're living in today. You can kind of come to appreciate it that way. And it seemed to me, right, the book seemed inspirational to me in many ways, like the questions it explored, the radical trajectories that were in it. I mean, it seemed to me that the latter option, of course, which is what our prof wanted us to do, was the way to go. I thought, yeah, that's what we should do. We should think about these historical ideas as live ideas. That's what's critical to do.
And did your parents encourage you to continue your studies in philosophy, or did you have to rebel against them to convince them that that's the right path for you?
Well, I wouldn't say I had to rebel, but let's just say that there was a fair bit of skepticism. I mean, even when I got a pretty nice scholarship to graduate school, my dad was pretty skeptical about the whole idea of doing graduate work in philosophy. He wasn't convinced that it would ultimately pay the bills, or, well, especially pay the bills, that it would result in anything especially productive. I mean, he was wrong about that, I'm happy to say, but still, yeah, there was a fair bit of initial parental skepticism and ongoing parental skepticism as the process unfolded. But at the same time, there's a lot of parental support too. I don't want to throw my dad under the bus here too much. But yeah, there definitely was some skepticism, Paul, for sure.
Yeah. No, I'm sure your dad loved and he wanted the best for you. So.
Yeah.
Did you bring in philosophical arguments to convey your points?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I figured out early in the game is that the more you frame things as philosophical arguments, the more people completely turn off. So what you need to do is you need to bring in ideas that are actually interesting philosophical ideas, but you need to kind of bring them in stealth mode so as not to kind of bring up the negative preconceptions that people have about philosophical ideas, frankly. So I kind of learned to do that early on, and I've continued to do that ever since as a graduate student and as a faculty member. I think one of the big challenges with maybe philosophical and historical ideas is to make them accessible and to kind of get past the negative feelings that people have, I think, frequently about these ideas. Not everybody has negative feelings, but there's a kind of pretentiousness that's associated with these ideas. And I think a lot of people really they need some help getting past that. Let's say that.
That's interesting. So you had to be a bit passive, not necessarily passive aggressive, but passive and optimistic maybe, or...
I'd say strategic.
Okay.
Strategic is how I would put it. I had to be a little bit strategic in how I pitched some of the ideas I wanted to pitch.
So you knew what you were doing, and you knew it from the start, kind of.
Well, I don't know if I knew it from the start, okay? There were definitely a fair number of hard lessons learned. I mean, I think I tried to pitch some of the more unadulterated philosophical ideas to my fellow undergrads, but my fellow undergrads were pretty skeptical, Paul. So I think I learned early on that, well, you know, you kind of have to sometimes repackage these ideas a little. They need a little bit of modern spinning sometimes to kind of get people intrigued.
So did you have any initial quote-unquote heroes in philosophy that inspired you from the very start?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, I wouldn't say really that I did. What I would say is that early on, especially in the years when I was an undergrad, I was just inspired by the tradition itself. I found the tradition itself really exciting. I thought, wow, look at these extraordinary endeavors to kind of resolve these really difficult questions. And I would read some particular philosopher, and then I'd read the successors that offer the critique. And I thought, well, the original idea was so good. How could there possibly be a critique even? But of course, there is a critique, and the critique's even more compelling than the original thing, right? So I was really in awe of what the tradition was capable of generating. I mean, the tradition generated some really, really amazing thinking and some real sources, I think, of ongoing inspiration in various ways. Yeah.
Could you name some of those inspirations, or?
Well, I mean, probably the biggest inspiration for me today, honestly, Paul, is philosophers of technology. Okay, I'm very, very much inspired by Martin Heidegger's and Jacques Ellul's philosophy of technology. It's probably the thing that has been, since I read it years and years ago, the kind of guiding star of a lot of my work. I really feel like, negative as the insights are, the insights of Ellul and Heidegger can really kind of help us come to grips with what's coming and what's already happened, technologically speaking. Now, some people think, that their analysis is just too negative, and I don't want to get into, whether that's the case or not. But for me, I feel as though the analysis is actually a very useful warning and a useful predictor. So I would say for me, that's been what's most inspirational, even if it's a bit of a dark inspiration.
And do you connect their work to certain happenings that are taking place today, and more specifically?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Let's take social media. What Ellul would say about a technology like that, one of Ellul's claims is that, there's no good or bad use of a technology. There is just the most efficient use. So what's the most efficient use of social media technology? It's as a kind of public manipulation tool, which I think is ultimately what has happened. It's certainly what happened in the 2016 election. I think it's happening on an ongoing basis. And if you took Ellul's predictions, Ellul didn't make predictions about the internet, or at least as far as I know he didn't. But at any rate, if you kind of distilled an Ellulian prediction about the internet in, let's say, 2002 versus all of the optimistic, hand-wavy predictions of the futurists of the time, I really think you would have been much, much better off with the Ellulian scenario, because that's what actually happened. And I think, unfortunately, the Ellulian scenario is probably pretty likely with AI too, right? There's all of this hand-waving about the liberatory possibilities of AI, but I think what Heidegger and Ellul would say is, don't hold your breath.
So there's a bit of historical consciousness in philosophical work, maybe, if people are trying to think about the future or what could happen to humanity or society.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is one of the things that I think is so rewarding about both philosophical and historical work, is that these ideas have tremendous pragmatic value. They have to be recontextualized, they have to be reconstructed. There's a tremendous amount of work to do with them. You can't just sort of take them unfiltered from their source. But I do think that there's a lot of work that these ideas can still do, right? Ellul's ideas, La Technique appeared in something like 1954 or something like this. But I really think that that's a set of live ideas. I think people need to read Jacques Ellul. I think it's very valuable. I think it really has tremendous pragmatic value still, sadly.
Are there other philosophers that inspire you?
Yeah, certainly Dewey. Dewey inspires me. Dewey inspires me with his long and tireless efforts to improve educational practice. He inspires me with his... what's really interesting is, I guess, what you might call the trajectory of Dewey's ideas. Dewey had a tremendously long career writing from the 1880s. I think his last work might have been in the 1950s. I'm not that solid on the dates right now. But in each of these eras, he really tried to come to grips with the time that he was in. And there are commonalities throughout all of his work, but he changed his work significantly in response to the challenges of his time. He was a really good public intellectual, I think, in that way. And he really tried to grapple with a lot of problems, especially technological change. I think Dewey's efforts to grapple with technological change were really interesting. I think the other thing that's really interesting about Dewey, and it's something that we see in Heidegger too, is there's this valorization of everyday experience. One of the big mistakes of Western philosophy, I think both Dewey and Heidegger thought, was this kind of departure from everydayness, from everyday experience as a base. And I think it's actually very interesting to kind of go back to that philosophically, to say, well, experience is where we need to start. I mean, it was an insight of William James too, but James and Dewey both had this idea, and I think it was a very, very valuable one. It's one I've argued actually has a lot of valence for thinking about video games. I really think we need to think about what's the experience involved in video games. And what Dewey and James both thought was experience counts. Every experience counts, in fact. This is the key educational question, is what does a particular experience count for, educationally speaking? That's the question that both of them asked. And as far as I'm concerned, it's still the question that we should be asking in 2025. Simple as it might be. It's simple in principle. In practice, it's a lot harder to kind of figure everything out, of course.
Very interesting. Is there one philosopher that you would stay away from? Put it nicely.
Is there one philosopher I'd stay away from? I mean, there's certainly philosophers where I've gotten less out of their work. I'm trying to think if there's anybody I'd actively stay away from. I can't think of anyone that I'd recommend. There's no one where I found absolutely no value in their work. I mean, if people obtain a kind of certain level of currency, I feel as though it's because that work really speaks to people in some significant way. If I did have to ward people away from anything, I mean, maybe don't spend your time as a teenager reading Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. You might be better off not reading those books. I do think, in fact, the world might be a better place if fewer people read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged as teenagers. Not that many do anymore, hopefully. Perhaps they do. I mean, I don't know what the objectivists are up to these days. But perhaps, I think, look, the ideas are actually very interesting. I actually think we should take those ideas way more seriously because they have much more currency than people seem to think. But would I want my teen reading Atlas Shrugged? Not really, frankly. Yeah, so there's a few ideas that perhaps people might be better off staying away from. I don't know. I mean, that's one that I can think of. I mean, there's obvious kind of white supremacist people and other folks like that. And
in philosophy?
Well.
Or in theory?
Well, in theory, I think. I'm just thinking about, sure, like, folks like Nazi thinking had a kind of intellectual firmament, right? I mean, I think we're better off not resurrecting ideas like that, obviously. I mean, so I'm just trying to think of what some examples might be of ideas we really don't want to resurrect. I mean, we don't want to kind of have intellectual legitimizers of what I view as xenophobic ideas. Yeah.
And Heidegger, where do you stand on him?
I mean, overall, I think that there's maybe some tendencies in Heideggerian thinking that led to an embrace of, let's say, some reactionary tendencies, all right? I mean, there's this hostility to modernity and social change that we find in Heidegger. So how are we going to rescue? How are we going to kind of rescue society from its decline? Okay? And I think if you kind of start getting into these narratives of how are you going to rescue society from its decline, I mean, look, this is, I think, one of the dangers, actually, of ideas that we find in philosophy of technology. I think there's a tendency, okay, there's a danger to kind of embrace a sort of return to the source, right? A kind of nostalgic and reactionary return to the source, which I think, unfortunately, Heidegger himself indulged in. So yeah, I think we have to be on the lookout for maybe some reactionary tendencies that might lurk in the ideas that we embrace. Be they, whether we're interested in Plato, whether we're interested in Heidegger. I mean, honestly, it's frankly hard to find any reactionary tendencies in Dewey whatsoever, but I think we can definitely find some in Heidegger who is much more hostile, who was much more hostile to social change than Dewey was.
That's interesting. So one last question before we move on to history. Wasn't Dewey interested in addressing a form of social decline too?
Yeah, he was interested in addressing a form of social decline, but it took a different form. I mean, one of the things, one of the reasons that sometimes I'm a bit critical of Dewey is how much he embraces science and technology. I mean, what Dewey thought, well, the big problem is that science and technology, especially industrial technology, have been concentrated in the wrong hands. They've been embraced by pirate capitalists of different turn-of-the-century stripes. So this was kind of his thinking. And what we needed to do was socialize the control of science and technology, and also in some sense socialize the dispersal so that everybody had a sort of scientific and technological competence. So Dewey's response to what he viewed as social problems was to kind of double down on science and technology in some ways. It was a kind of really forward-thinking response. So yeah, I mean, Dewey does critique what he sees as decline or bad tendencies as a result of social and technological change, but it's not a reactionary critique. He felt that that was a dead end. It's this kind of very forward-looking approach. I think a little bit too forward-looking, because ultimately I'm not convinced that certain aspects of that progressive approach are really going to work, which is a long and difficult question that I don't know if we have real time to get into. But I don't see Dewey, I see Dewey as someone concerned about social problems, but basically completely lacking in any reactionary tendencies whatsoever.
Interesting. All right, let's talk history.
Sure.
What's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history, and why do you think that image comes to mind?
Well, I always like to think, the first thing that I think about when I think of history, when I think about my contact with history, is I think about Mr. Chisholm's grade 8 history class, which was, on the one hand, a class that I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed it. Mr. Chisholm was an engaging teacher. It was a really fun class. There wasn't too much work. We'd debate a lot of things and kind of throw ideas around. On the other hand, it wasn't necessarily the most rigorous class either. I remember we watched a quote-unquote documentary on Nostradamus, and my grade 8 self, my grade 8 self, the movie finished with the prediction that the world, I think, was going to end in 1999. Of course, none of Nostradamus's previous predictions had been wrong, and so the world was going to end in 1999. And my little grade 8 self thought, oh dear, I've only got like 6 years to go here. So yeah, I mean, that I think is the first thing that I think about when I think about history, is my wonderful but a little bit wild grade 8 history class when I first kind of did history for the first time, I guess.
And did students ask him about 1999, the teacher?
We were all, I think, a little bit concerned about 1999, but maybe me most of all. I don't know, somehow the documentary seemed airtight to me.
Was this before or after you read The Republic?
Yeah, well, this was definitely before. So I was 14 years old, okay? I didn't have any television at home, Paul. So like videos always had a kind of big impact on me when I saw them at school. And so I took this documentary for fact, okay? And I thought, oh dear, what will happen in 1999? I mean, Nostradamus has been so accurate so far. So yeah, I was very concerned about it. Honestly, I think my classmates, who were maybe a little bit less in earnest in the history class than I was, were a little bit less worried. But me, I was definitely, counting my days a little bit.
And did Mr. Chisholm say anything about 1999? Did he try to downplay it, or did he say, live your life to the fullest, you have 6 years left?
Honestly, I mean, Mr. Chisholm, to his credit, was a guy who lived his life to the fullest. And I'm sure that that's what he would have suggested. But I honestly can't remember any particular injunctions about what to do. I really feel like my concerns about 1999 were mostly my private anxiety. I'm sure my classmates, at North Queens Rural High School in rural Nova Scotia wouldn't have been all that sympathetic to my concerns at the time.
So you probably answered this next question because I asked you about the first idea or image, but now I wanted to ask you about your earliest memory of your connection to history.
I mean, my earliest memory of my connection to history, I don't know. I think, honestly, Paul, I've always been interested. I've always been interested in history ever since I was a teenager, and as a kid I was somebody who read widely and was really interested, especially in what had previously happened politically in Canada. Again, as a kid, I'd grown up in a leftist family, but I was living in a place, rural Nova Scotia, that is extremely conservative and very traditional in terms of how people approached life. And these leftist ideas, I was very excited about them. I was kind of excited about the history of the left in Canada, which my family was excited about this as well and had told me about it, and I'd read a lot about it as a kid. And so I think that might have been perhaps the history that I had the most contact with as a teenager, was the history of the left in Canada, because I was really interested in that. I was really interested in what had been accomplished and kind of what might be possible in the future when everybody saw the light and embraced these ideas.
In terms of social justice?
Yeah, in terms of social justice, absolutely.
So did that interest in the history of the left influence the way you see things? Or has it influenced the way you see things over time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, honestly, well, these days, sometimes I feel despairing. Okay, I'll give you an interesting example, Paul. Okay, so in this teacher free speech stuff that Kevin McDonough at McGill and Bruce Maxwell at UDAM and I have been working on, one of the things that I looked at as kind of my part of the project was the history of how we might think about teachers having a right to free speech in the classroom. Because, of course, we all know that professors kind of have this tradition of academic freedom, and it's actually an established right to academic freedom in some sense, right? It's actually recognized by the courts. Well, in the early 20th century, there was a huge movement among American teachers to promote a similar right for teachers. They thought, aren't teachers worthy of having a similar right to free academic inquiry, the same kind of right that professors are trying to establish at this time? And so a lot of the teachers' unions were actually fighting alongside higher education folks at the time to establish this right. And it's really interesting to me because at the time, this was something that people thought was really possible to get. And they were making progress in terms of getting it. I mean, these folks that were interested in establishing this right were the same folks that effectively established teacher tenure in the United States. So they actually accomplished a lot, these early American union leaders who were, frankly, in many cases, really interesting leftist activists, especially many of them were in New York at the time. But yeah, I mean, sometimes I look back at that time. I look back at the time and I look at that particular historical context and I look at the aspirations that people had at that time. I mean, as bad as conditions were in other ways, it really strikes me that we are so far now. We are so far from being able to have those kinds of aspirations for the teaching profession. We can't even really take those aspirations fully seriously now. Okay, I mean, that historical time is gone. So yeah, I mean, sometimes I often feel really despairing. I mean, I feel like the left has really accomplished a lot, unbelievable things, frankly, in the 20th century. But there's a lot that didn't happen too. And sometimes when I think about what didn't happen, but what could have happened, I feel pretty sad about it. I mean, I feel like in some ways the story of teacher free speech is a sad one. It's I think what was at one point a really worthy goal, but we effectively gave up on it. We made some progress, but we ultimately gave up, and now it's completely out of reach.
So teacher free speech was a thing on the left back in the day.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And today, would you say it's something on the right?
Well, I mean, let's just say this. the question of teacher free speech has always been a preoccupation of the right. It was a preoccupation of the right in the 1920s, and it's a preoccupation of the right now. Okay, but establishing teacher autonomy in the 1920s was a major preoccupation of the left. I mean, well, especially of these activist unions who were full of piss and vinegar. But now, I mean, that's no longer the case. I don't think it's really a live or interesting question on the left, which, I mean, in some ways is fair, right? There's other battles to be fought. But when I look at the history of activism in favor of teacher autonomy, what really strikes me is that 100 years ago or so, the wind was really in people's sails. And now, the wind has definitely slackened.
Do you think it's temporary?
Hard to know. I don't think it's temporary because I think we're in a period where our institutions are under extraordinary threat and are in decline. They're under attack from the right. They're being eroded at many different points. And I really think that many of us who are more on the left are just engaged in a battle to preserve the institutions that we've won over the course of the 20th century and not have them rolled back further, right? I don't think like in teacher autonomy, we can really be in a position to obtain new goals when we're trying to prevent the destruction of public schooling writ large, right? I really feel like we're kind of fighting a defensive battle on the left on a lot of these issues because I really feel there's been and I'm sure that many listeners to this podcast probably share this feeling, that there's been a real reactionary resurgence lately.
And what role does technology play?
Well, I mean, honestly, Paul, I think you'll get a variety of answers to this. One of my favorite books that I've read recently is a book called Bitcoin, Software as Right-Wing Extremism. Okay, it's by a guy called David Columbia who died last year. I really think that we need to think about technology as a corrosive social force and ask ourselves, how are we going to preserve our institutions in the face of technological change? I think serious threats to institutions from AI. I actually think the most serious threat may come from cryptocurrency, which I think threatens to entirely detach capital from meaningful social control, okay, which I think would be an extremely, extremely bad outcome. I mean, cryptocurrency comes to us from the radical right. And I think it's very important to understand that that was the source of the idea. And even if it's not necessarily folks on the radical right who endorse it now, there's a reason. There's a reason that that idea came from there. It's because, again, the detachment of capital from social control is a kind of right-wing dream. And I do think it's going to have very negative effects if that idea catches on even more so than it has already done.
Let's get back to history.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm being a real downer here, Paul. I'm being a real downer. I'm just saying negative thing after negative thing. I do have some friendly things to say. So maybe somehow in the course of this conversation, we'll get to some of those. I hope.
Okay. Do you want to say something friendly now?
No. I mean, you can keep asking me questions and I'll keep coming up with responses. So yeah.
Okay, good.
I'll try to be a little bit more positive. We'll see if I can
just be yourself and be spontaneous and direct.
Sure.
Okay, so could you please describe a moment in time, an incident, an episode in your professional life or in your everyday life where you had to justify the importance of using history to attain a goal, to make some kind of change, positive social change perhaps, through your work? And what was your justification for using history?
All right, so I'll give another example from my teacher free speech work. So I didn't have to justify this that hard, but I did have to justify it a little bit. So we were on the lookout we were doing a survey about how do teachers feel about their right to be autonomous in the classroom. I mean, how do they feel about how many free speech rights they have? Where do they feel that the sources of pressure come from in the classroom? Which sorts of issues do they feel comfortable speaking about? Where do they feel less comfortable? So we were looking for kind of models of a survey. And of course, what's the first place that we're going to look? We're going to look at the empirical research literature, the recent empirical research literature, because it's usually the easiest place to find surveys like this, and why reinvent the wheel? So that's what we did. And we found some stuff, okay? We found some stuff, but honestly, the stuff really wasn't that great, okay? So I was, again, doing my little historical component of the project, and I found this amazing book. I mean, honestly, this is a book that I'd recommend to any of the listeners out there because it's just a completely wild book. It's totally nuts from beginning to end, and it's really stuck with me ever since I've read it. I mean, it's something like 700, 800 pages long. It's totally, totally wild. And the book is called Are American Teachers Free? Okay, it was commissioned by George Counts, who is a really big progressive ed guy. And unfortunately, the author's name is escaping me right now. I mean, Paul, maybe you can fill it in after the fact on the special liner notes for this podcast edition or whatever. But anyway, Are American Teachers Free? What the guy did is he actually created, he was a historian, and he created this survey, which he tried to distribute to as many American teachers as he possibly could. Okay, so this was the 1920s, so he put ads in teacher magazines, he mailed it to people, he got superintendents to distribute it, he got teachers' unions to distribute it, he did all kinds of things. But the bottom line is, this 1920 survey was by far the most rigorously constructed and relevant example of a survey that I could find. And happily, at the end of this 800-page tome, there it was. So I told my colleagues, you guys won't believe this, but there is actually a really great survey from the 1920s that we can use as a basis for our empirical work now. Now, of course, we can't take every question. Things have to be updated. But the kind of overall way in which the survey was conceived was actually really thoughtful and really rigorous and had some interesting aspects that actually we had not thought of. So this was a kind of wonderful use of history to my mind. I mean, the 700 or 800 pages which preceded the survey instrument itself were really interesting because it discussed the results of the survey. And let me tell you, in the 1920s, the answer to Are American Teachers Free? Was hell no, okay? They really had a rough time of it, as they still do today in many cases. But there were a lot of very dark anecdotes in the book, which is why any teachers listening, I highly recommend you take a look at this book because it's very interesting. But yeah, so I had to convince my colleagues a little bit that this old 1920 survey could in fact be updated and repurposed, and we did it, and we turned it into a pretty large-scale empirical study, and we published it. And I think it's one of the survey that we did of Canadian and American teachers. I think it's a really good survey. We're continuing to build on that. But historical work, me reading, okay, and me kind of recovering this historical work was actually, I think, a critical part in making our survey a lot better.
So what does history do then?
What does history do? I mean, now, Paul, you're the best fella to answer this. But I mean, for me, what history does is history is a kind of inexhaustible source of possibilities. We go back, we look at these ideas, we look at these events, and we see what transpired, and we see what we can do with it. I mean, this is a kind of Deweyan conception. How do we kind of reconstruct the past? How do we interpret it? How do we reconstruct it? How do we kind of see it in terms of how it might or might not lead up to where we find ourselves today? What can be done with it? I think a tremendous amount can be done with historical narratives, with historical ideas. Not every narrative and not every idea is going to be useful, but many are. And many are useful just to kind of serve as a kind of alternative. I mean, one of the most interesting things about doing the history of philosophy is there's a kind of anthropological aspect where you're able to see through the filter of the philosophy, alternative social structures, which is really interesting, I think. So, yeah, I mean, history shows us alternatives, it shows us possibilities, it shows us pitfalls, it gives us all these interesting possibilities for reconstruction, all this tremendous material with which to work, I think.
So, would you use history in a classroom, let's say, to help students solve specific problems and leave it at that, or would you go beyond the problem solving?
Well, I feel it has there's kind of an intrinsic value, I find, in reading history just because of the stories in some sense. But I don't want to be too goal-directed with students. Okay, I don't want to be too goal-directed with them because I find if I say, well, I want you to use this to solve a problem, that somehow it's forcing the issue too much. What I prefer to think about, especially like I have this class called Radical Educational Theories, where I get students to read all of these really crazy 20th century educational theories. And what I want them to do is I want them to really think about those theories in terms of thinking how those theories open up interesting possibilities. Not all of those theories are going to do that for them. Many of them are going to be repellent to the students or are going to be uninteresting to the students, but some of the ideas are going to be interesting to them. And what I want them to do is I want them to do something with the ideas they find interesting. I want them to be inspired by the ideas, because if you are inspired by an idea, that means you are doing something with it at that point, right? You're picking up the tool and you're using the tool. I always say to the students, look, I don't just want to read about these ideas, what they are, right? That's pretty useless. I want you to pick up the ideas and do something with them. Think about, now, I mean, there's some unfortunate aspects of this metaphor here, but think about using the ideas like an axe. I want you to get out there. I want you to chop some wood with those ideas. I want you to do something with them. I want you to put those ideas into action, because I really feel that's the Deweyan thing to do, is to mobilize ideas, not just have them sit compartmentalized and know them for the sake of cataloging purposes. No, the point is do something with them. But I try to give the students some freedom in this process, because I feel if I force them to do it too much, then they won't be inspired. And again, the point is to be inspired so that you see that these ideas are live ideas, that they have that potential for you to do something with them.
Is there, based on what you said, could you differentiate between personal and collective uses of history?
Personal and collective uses of history.
Because what you said right now seems to be more at an individual level for students to be able to not necessarily be told how to use history, but to just see it as a repertoire of ideas that they could use to engage with social problems if they so choose, and to use them as tools, like you said, to help them get from point A to point B, for example.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the collective question, I guess, there's this question of, how do we kind of employ, how do we mobilize history on a large scale? I mean, one way in which we do that is through the curriculum, right? And I think there probably can't be quite as free as we are in a higher ed context. In the higher ed context, I kind of let the students pick and choose and chart their own path. I think that it obviously has to be less personalized. If we're talking curriculum, you've got to kind of have a process that you want students to follow. I don't know, Paul. It's an interesting question, and I think it's one for history educators maybe a bit more. Well, I guess in some sense I'm a history educator too. How do we mobilize these ideas on a kind of collective basis? This idea of a more collective historical consciousness is interesting. I think Quebec certainly has the idea of collective historical consciousness alive in it as a place much more than Canada does these days. One of the things that you see in public philosophy in Quebec is a kind of attempt to mobilize historical ideas for interesting purposes. I mean, I think in the Bouchard-Taylor report, for example, I think one of the interesting things that you see in the Bouchard-Taylor report is this attempt, I think, within the report to use the history of Quebec to try to inspire a kind of new model of social integration. I mean, I think that's a really interesting idea to do kind of on a collective level, right? I mean, so I do think that there are these interesting collective possibilities. I'm not thinking off the cuff about them very well right now. I mean, what I feel like what I do as a teacher is much more personal. But I do think there are really interesting collective possibilities.
But it follows a similar pattern. There's an issue or a problem that needs to be solved, and history can come in and help solve a problem at a individual and or collective level.
Yeah, I'd say, I would. I mean, I kind of resist solving the locution of solving the problem. I kind of like providing possibilities for moving forward. I kind of like the idea of moving us further, right? Because I don't feel like it necessarily solves the problem, but it does provide a pathway forward in many cases that I think is really interesting and motivating, maybe. Yeah.
Does this relate to what you were saying earlier about Dewey?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think that that's what Dewey hopes for from, it's interesting, right? I mean, if you look at what Dewey did at his experimental school, one of the things that he wanted students to do was to study the history of industrial technology. He thought that the history of industrial technology, the history of science was really fundamental for students because by looking at that, they would be stimulated to ask questions about what we're going to do next with science and technology. If we've kind of seen this kind of pathway where, these developments have allowed for all of these new human possibilities, then why shouldn't we appropriate these developments collectively and use them as a path forward? So for Dewey, the history of science and technology was clearly supposed to kind of open up a particular kind of thinking ahead on the part of students about what was going to be possible in the new, more progressive society. So yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a strong resonance in terms of the way that I think about history and the way that Dewey thought about history. I mean, effectively, I think I probably basically think in a Deweyan way about it.
So based on what you've said, is history a good thing or can it also be a bad thing?
Well, I mean, I think it can definitely be a bad thing. I mean, I do think that there are people who kind of want to mobilize nostalgic images of the nation and particular kinds of stories for the wrong reasons. Okay, I mean, we see this among American conservatives these days. They want to tell triumphant stories about the nation, right? And I mean, I think what we see there is a kind of dark mobilization of history in various ways. And now, if you're a Christian homeschooler, you can probably have your kids read various Bowdlerized histories of the United States that are kind of like unbroken narratives of triumph, right? So, I mean, I think this is a negative use of historical ideas. But, I mean, as I've said, I do think that there are all of these positive uses of history, all of these ones that I think are more agential, if you will, right? That kind of open up possibilities of human agency. I do think that there are uses of history that lock people into particular kinds of narratives and pathways. And I think that takes away from their agency. It's detrimental, in fact, limits social possibility. And I mean, I think we see this with a lot of right-wing triumphalism and nostalgia uses history in various kinds of unfortunate ways.
Do you think your background or your earlier interests in the history of the left have influenced the way you think about history or the way you just discussed history's good and bad sides? Would you say history is political and ideological?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, certainly it's a political and ideological endeavor. I mean, to some degree, right? I mean, everybody's got an axe to grind as a historian. And we see this. We see this. I mean, different people have bigger and more distinct axes than others, but everybody's got a kind of particular position that they're telling the story from, and usually a particular motivation to tell it. And this is certainly something that we have to keep in mind as academics, and that we have to try our best to teach our students to look for.
Can we ever escape politics?
No,
when
never.
we do history? Never?
Never. There's no escape. I mean, everything always has political ramifications. There's no getting away from it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I wonder, okay, I remember I was in grad school and I took a class with a guy named Julius Moravchik. I didn't actually take the class because I went to the first class and it seemed too boring to me, okay? But I remember I went to the class and it was a history of ancient Greek mathematics, okay? I mean, he was a historian of philosophy, and I was like, boy, you know, I really didn't want to take this class. It just seemed too arcane to me. And I wonder, well, are there people with axes to grind in that field, intellectually speaking? Probably there are. What are the political valences of those axes? I mean, I don't know. I mean,
But they're there.
Probably they're there. Probably they're there. I'm sure that some, appropriate, maybe we'll have some knowledgeable historian of mathematics listening that will tell us that, in fact, there are kind of political agendas in the history of mathematics. So probably there are. But certainly in a lot of history, the politics are just inextricable, I think. It's just an inevitable. I mean, history is part of life, and life has this political dimension.
Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share about history, Dewey, Heidegger?
Well, I mean, I guess the final thought that I'd have to share is that I've had so much fun reading historical work, that I think historians are amazing people, that I think the history of philosophy is terrific, that I think the history of education is really neglected, and that there's a tremendous amount to be learned from it. So, I mean, I hope that those are inspiring words and appropriate words with which to conclude the podcast there, Paul, that history is great stuff, and I hope that people continue to engage with it.
Before we go, one last question. You talked about mentioning something friendly.
Yeah.
Did you already mention something friendly?
Did I? I don't know. I think I did. I think I mentioned a few positive things, right? I said some nice things about history. I did mention something friendly. What I will say is that the view from Paul Zanazanian's office, people, is really to die for. We have a beautiful view of Mount Royal here. It's absolutely spectacular here in the great city of Montreal. It's a lovely summer day. So I do wish to communicate to all of you out there listening some positive thoughts and the beauty of the landscape here before me. So perhaps we can conclude on that idyllic note.
David Waddington, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Paul.